On September 1st, 1939, the same morning German armored columns crossed into Poland. A 58-year-old brigadier general named George Catlett Marshall walked into the War Department building in Washington, D.C., and took an oath that would alter the direction of history. That day, Marshall deliberately wore a white civilian suit, carefully avoiding his military uniform so that he would not appear eager for the war that had just erupted in Europe. At 10:30 that morning, inside the office of Secretary of War Harry Woodring, Marshall was sworn in as Chief of Staff of the United States Army and elevated to the rank of full general. He had received news of the German invasion at 3:50 a.m. By the time he raised his hand to take the oath, Warsaw was already under bombardment. The army Marshall inherited was a disaster waiting to unfold. Fewer than 190,000 soldiers served in uniform. In global terms, the United States Army ranked roughly 19th in the world, smaller than the armed forces of Portugal, Switzerland, and Belgium. To place this in perspective, Germany had just invaded Poland with more than 1,500,000 troops. The entire American army could have been swallowed by a single German army group, with room left over. The condition of the army's equipment reflected its neglect. Much of it dated back to the previous war. Tanks were so scarce that soldiers trained using trucks with signs painted on them reading tank. The Army possessed fewer than 500 tanks in total, most of them light models that would have been destroyed within minutes if they had faced German panzers. Artillery pieces were leftovers from 1918. Rifles were the same Springfield models that American doughboys had carried into the trenches of France more than 20 years earlier. Even on paper, the structure of the Army was misleading. The 9 infantry divisions that officially existed were mostly hollow shells. Only 3 divisions were anywhere near full strength. The remaining 6 averaged barely 3,000 men each instead of the 15,000 required for combat readiness. The 4 field armies responsible for administering the continental United States operated with skeletal staffs of only 4,400 troops each. Not a single American division possessed full operational capability. Yet Marshall understood that the crisis went deeper than shortages of equipment or manpower. The real problem was leadership. The officers who would be required to command American soldiers in the coming war were, in Marshall's judgment, too old, too rigid, and too comfortable in their positions to lead men in modern combat. When he looked at his general officers, Marshall saw what he later described as considerable arterial sclerosis. The average age of the generals was alarmingly high. Many had occupied the same posts for years, presiding over the same modest commands, attending the same social gatherings, and fighting the same bureaucratic battles they had been fighting for decades. Marshall knew that sentiment and tradition could not be allowed to stand in the way of national survival. Within 2 years, he would force out approximately 600 officers from the Army. He would end long careers, strain friendships, and make powerful enemies in Congress. He would be accused of gutting the Army's brains, and in doing so, he would create the generation of commanders who ultimately won the Second World War. The problem Marshall confronted had been building for 2 decades. In the peacetime Army, promotion operated almost entirely through seniority. An officer could not advance until someone above him retired or died. Below the rank of brigadier general, there was virtually no alternative path upward. Merit counted for little. Initiative was often punished. The safest career strategy was simple: avoid mistakes, cultivate relationships with superiors, and wait. The result was a bottleneck planners called the hump. Roughly 4,200 officers, nearly 1/3 of the entire regular Army officer corps, were crowded into an extraordinarily narrow age range. These men had entered service during the First World War, received rapid wartime promotions during that conflict, and then watched their careers stall for the next 20 years. The numbers painted a grim picture. More than 1,800 captains were already in their 40s. Over 1,000 officers whose age and experience qualified them for lieutenant colonel remained stuck at the rank of captain in 1940. Even more striking, 234 lieutenants were also in their 40s, men who had spent more than 2 decades trapped at the most junior commissioned rank. The problem fed upon itself. Talented young officers looked upward and saw no future. Many of the best left for civilian careers where ability was rewarded. Those who remained often became cynical, going through the motions of military service while simply waiting for retirement. The peacetime army was neither attracting nor retaining the talent it would desperately need in war. Marshall understood this failure personally. During the First World War, he had served as a colonel, first as Chief of Operations for the 1st Infantry Division, and later as Chief of Staff for the 8th Corps and the 1st Army. His performance had been exceptional. General John J. Pershing, commander of the American Expeditionary Forces, regarded Marshall as one of the most capable officers in the Army. But after the armistice, Marshall's temporary wartime rank disappeared. He was reduced to captain. The wartime promotions evaporated. It would take him 15 more years to regain the rank of colonel. The very system that had nearly derailed his own career was now his to reform. The generals who commanded the United States Army in 1939 were themselves products of this broken system. Most had reached their positions through patience rather than performance. They had waited their turn, avoided controversy, and simply outlasted competitors. The traits that made them successful in peacetime, caution, deference to superiors, and mastery of bureaucratic procedure, were precisely the traits that would get soldiers killed in war. Marshall had observed these officers for years. He knew their strengths and their weaknesses. He knew which men could adapt to change and which could not. He knew who would rise when faced with crisis and who would collapse under pressure. The judgments he had formed over more than 3 decades of service would now determine who led the American Army into battle. In April 1940, Marshall appeared before Congress and explained his views with characteristic bluntness. Leadership in the field, he said, depended in large part on one's legs, stomach, and nervous system. It required the ability to endure exhaustion, hunger, and lack of sleep, while still commanding energetically and aggressively. A commander had to dominate men on the battlefield, not merely supervise them. The generals Marshall had inherited, he believed, could not meet this standard. Most were too old to command troops under the terrible strain of modern warfare. Their minds were locked into outdated patterns, and they were unable to adjust to new conditions. This judgment was not theoretical. Marshall had carefully studied the German campaigns in Poland and France. He had seen how speed, aggression, and initiative at every level of command shattered larger forces that relied on slow, methodical approaches. The Germans had introduced a new way of war. Their commanders made decisions in hours that traditional armies would have taken days to make. When success appeared, they exploited it immediately, driving deep into enemy territory before defenders could respond. The officers who would lead American soldiers against such an enemy would need to think and act very differently from their predecessors. They would have to move quickly, decide rapidly, and accept risk. They would need the physical stamina to command near the front rather than from comfortable headquarters miles behind the lines. And they would need the moral courage to make hard decisions when lives were at stake. Removing senior officers from command, however, was not a simple task. The Army's traditions stretched back to the Revolutionary War. Officers had friends in Congress, connections in industry, and classmates scattered throughout the service. Careers spanning decades could not be ended without consequences. The political dangers were immense. Every general marshal pushed aside left-behind former subordinates who would remember the slight. Every forced retirement created enemies who might later undermine him. The wives of senior officers formed powerful social networks in Washington capable of shaping reputations and careers. Marshall was not simply reforming the Army, he was disrupting an entire way of life. Marshall moved forward anyway. He had faced resistance before. Early in his career, he had once contradicted General Pershing during a meeting and fully expected to be relieved. Instead, Pershing promoted him. Marshall learned that honest advice, delivered respectfully but firmly, earned more respect than flattery or silence. He applied that lesson now. At first, he acted quietly. Using his authority as Chief of Staff, Marshall reassigned senior officers to less critical posts, passed them over for promotion, and encouraged early retirement. When these measures proved insufficient, he sought legislative authority to remove officers directly. The mechanism he created became known as the Plucking Board, though its official title was the Removal Board. The Second Supplemental Appropriation Act of 1940 granted Marshall the power he needed by eliminating the requirement that promotions below brigadier general be based solely on seniority. This change allowed him to promote younger officers over their seniors and to remove those who could not meet the demands of modern command. The board itself consisted of 6 retired general officers, chosen deliberately so that serving officers would not be judging potential rivals. To further legitimize the process, Marshall asked his immediate predecessor as Chief of Staff, General Malin Craig, to come out of retirement and chair the board. Craig had served from 1935 to 1939 and was widely respected throughout the Army. His involvement ensured that no one could credibly accuse Marshall of settling personal scores. Marshall's written instructions defined the board's philosophy. Its mission, he explained, was not to balance a long and successful career against a recent failure in 1940 or 1941. It was not the board's role to judge how good a man had been in the past. Instead, its task was to determine an officer's value to the Army today. The times were critical. The standard had to be present performance. Officers selected for removal were given 1 year to retire, a more dignified exit than immediate dismissal, but a clear end to their careers. The board's authority was sweeping. It could remove any officer from line promotion for reasons it deemed sufficient. The documented removals revealed the scope of the effort. In the summer and fall of 1941 alone, the board removed 31 colonels, 117 lieutenant colonels, 31 majors, 16 captains, and 269 National Guard and Reserve officers. Lieutenant colonels formed the largest group because they represented the bottleneck of World War I veterans who had been waiting decades for advancement. In the 5 years before Marshall became Chief of Staff, only 37 officers total had been removed from the Army, an average of fewer than 8 per year. Under Marshall, the rate increased more than 5-fold. In the end, approximately 500 colonels were forced into retirement. Marshall later estimated that he had pushed out at least 600 officers before the United States entered the war. The full scope of Marshall's purge became unmistakably visible during the Casualties, Louisiana maneuvers of August and September 1941. These enormous exercises, involving nearly 500,000 troops spread across wide areas of Louisiana and East Texas, served as Marshall's final examination of the Army's leadership. At the time, they were the largest military maneuvers ever conducted in American history. Their purpose went far beyond testing tactics. They were designed to evaluate leadership under conditions that closely resembled real combat. Units maneuvered continuously both day and night. Communications regularly broke down. Carefully prepared plans collapsed and had to be rewritten under pressure. The fog of war, or something very close to it, settled over commanders who had spent decades operating within the predictable routines of peacetime service. Marshall moved constantly from one command post to another, observing how generals reacted to confusion and failure. He watched who adapted, who improvised, and who froze. He paid close attention to how commanders communicated with their staffs and how they sustained the morale of exhausted troops. Of the 42 generals who commanded a division, corps, or army during the maneuvers, historians later estimated that only 11 would go on to hold combat commands during the Second World War. The remaining 31 were reassigned, quietly retired, or pushed aside entirely. Marshall had seen what he needed to see. One episode from the maneuvers became legendary. George S. Patton, then commanding the 2nd Armored Division, was expected to be contained by a defensive line. Instead, he led his tanks on a night march around the enemy's flank, moving so rapidly that the umpires struggled to keep up. At dawn, Patton's armored column burst into the headquarters of Lieutenant General Hugh Drum, effectively capturing the opposing commander. The maneuver was bold, aggressive, and precisely the kind of initiative Marshall wanted to encourage. Patton demonstrated that he could think and move faster than his opponents. Drum demonstrated that he could not adapt when circumstances changed unexpectedly. Marshall took note of both lessons. The officers Marshall removed were not incompetent men. Many had served honorably for decades, and some had distinguished records from the First World War, but Marshall applied a ruthless standard. Past achievement meant nothing if an officer could not perform in the present. A brilliant career was irrelevant if a man's best years were already behind him. One confrontation illustrated Marshall's approach perfectly. A senior general at Fort Leavenworth was ordered to revise the Army's training manuals to reflect lessons learned from the German campaigns in Europe. The officer told Marshall the task would require 18 months. Marshall countered with 3 months. The general refused. Marshall then offered 4 months. The officer insisted that such comprehensive revisions were impossible in less than a year and a half. Marshall warned him to be very careful before repeating that answer. When the general stood by his position, Marshall responded calmly, "I am sorry. Then you are relieved." The incident revealed something essential about Marshall's leadership. He did not raise his voice. He did not threaten. He simply stated the requirement and accepted no excuses. Officers who could not meet his standards were removed, regardless of their previous service or their personal connections. The manuals, incidentally, were completed in 4 months by other officers. Marshall displayed the same firmness toward personal acquaintances. One general ordered to France on an important mission explained that he could not depart immediately because his wife was away and their household furniture had not yet been unpacked. Marshall called the officer personally to confirm his position. When the general repeated his explanation, Marshall replied, "My God, man, we are at war, and you are a general. I am sorry, but you will be retired tomorrow." The most prominent casualty of Marshall's reforms was Lieutenant General Hugh Drum. Although Drum was passed over rather than formally removed, his fate was widely understood as a judgment on his fitness for modern command. Drum had reached the rank of Major General in 1930 and had held nearly every senior post below Chief of Staff. He had served as Chief of Staff of the First Army in France during the First World War, a role that Douglas MacArthur later claimed meant Drum had virtually run the Army. By seniority and experience alone, Drum appeared the obvious choice for Chief of Staff. But Drum had promoted his own candidacy too aggressively, alienating President Franklin D. Roosevelt. He lobbied openly for the position, cultivated press coverage, and made his expectations unmistakably clear. When the appointment was made in 1939, Roosevelt passed over Drum and 32 other senior officers to select Marshall, who ranked 34th in overall Army seniority. Marshall had been outranked by 21 major generals and 11 brigadier generals. Drum never accepted the decision and never stopped maneuvering for high command. During the war, he was summoned to Washington, believing he would receive command of American forces in Europe, based on a conversation he had once had with Roosevelt. Instead, Marshall offered him the position of Chief of Staff to Chiang Kai-shek in China. Drum objected strongly. He described the mission as vague, uncertain, and indefinite. He complained about serving three masters: the Chinese, the British, and Washington. When Marshall explained that no large American forces would be sent to China, Drum argued that he would be wasted in such a post. Marshall concluded that Drum lacked enthusiasm for the assignment and recommended against sending him. On January 14, 1942, Joseph Stilwell was selected instead. When Stilwell was asked whether he would accept the difficult China command, his reply was simple: "I will go where I am sent." Drum was reassigned to command the Eastern Defense Command, essentially overseeing home defense along the American East Coast. He reached mandatory retirement age at 64 in September 1943. Although he received a second Distinguished Service Medal, presented by Marshall himself, he never received the combat command he had sought for decades. In a final irony, Fort Drum in New York bears his name. No military installation carries Marshall's. The officers Marshall removed made room for the men he believed could actually win the war. But identifying those men required a different and rarer talent: the ability to recognize potential before it had been fully proven, to see what an officer might become rather than what he had already achieved. Over time, a legend developed around Marshall's methods. It was widely said that he carried a little black book containing the names of promising officers he had observed throughout his career. The story was repeated so often that it eventually became accepted as fact. Even Marshall's own biographer, Forrest Pogue, repeated the story, giving it an air of authority. But the little black book never existed. The George C. Marshall Foundation has confirmed that no such notebook was ever found among Marshall's papers. When Dr. Larry Bland, editor of the Papers of George Catlett Marshall, questioned Pogue directly on two separate occasions, Pogue admitted the story was a myth. He acknowledged that he had repeated it when it was widely believed to be true, and later expressed regret for including it, saying it gave legitimacy to a story that did not deserve it. What Marshall actually possessed was an extraordinary memory. Throughout his long career, he observed officers from positions that gave him unique insight. At Fort Benning, where he served as assistant commandant from 1927 to 1932, he watched hundreds of officers teach, learn, and lead. He observed others in China, in Washington, and across numerous staff and command assignments. He took note of who displayed initiative and who waited for orders, who could think clearly under pressure, and who froze, who inspired men, and who merely commanded them. The list of promising officers existed entirely in Marshall's mind. He could recall conversations from years earlier, impressions formed in passing, and flashes of potential revealed in a single exercise or staff meeting. This mental record, accumulated slowly over decades, would determine who led American forces into battle. During Marshall's years at Fort Benning, approximately 150 future generals attended the infantry school, with about 50 serving on the faculty. Marshall observed all of them. He assigned difficult problems and watched carefully how officers responded. He noted who asked sharp questions and who accepted easy answers. Those who stood out later became known as the Marshall Men, and once Marshall gained the authority to promote their careers accelerated rapidly. The rise of Dwight D. Eisenhower demonstrated Marshall's method in practice. Their first meaningful interaction occurred in 1930, when Marshall noticed a young major working on the staff of the American Battle Monuments Commission. Eisenhower had assisted General John J. Pershing in revising his memoirs, a task that required tact, intelligence, and the ability to manage a difficult superior. Marshall recognized these qualities and remembered Eisenhower's name. Later, Marshall offered Eisenhower a position on the faculty at Fort Benning. Eisenhower declined politely, explaining that he already had orders for a coveted general staff assignment in Washington. The refusal did not offend Marshall. If anything, it demonstrated Eisenhower's independence and confidence, traits Marshall valued. Their paths crossed again during the Louisiana maneuvers in September 1941. Eisenhower, then a lieutenant colonel, served as being chief of staff for Lieutenant General Walter Kruger's Third Army. His performance caught Marshall's attention. Eisenhower helped plan operations that repeatedly outmaneuvered the opposing force. His staff work was thorough without being rigid. When circumstances changed, he adapted quickly. The decisive moment came on December 14, 1941, exactly 1 week after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. Marshall summoned Eisenhower to Washington. Eisenhower flew from Fort Sam Houston, Texas, arriving exhausted after delays and poor weather. It was the first time he had spoken to Marshall for more than a few minutes. Marshall presented a grim overview of the situation in the Pacific. The Philippines, where Eisenhower had served under Douglas MacArthur for 4 years, were under attack. The Pacific Fleet had been badly damaged at Pearl Harbor. Japanese forces were advancing rapidly across Southeast Asia. The strategic situation appeared desperate. Then Marshall posed a test. What should be our general line of action? Eisenhower asked for a desk and a few hours. Marshall provided both. Several hours later, Eisenhower returned with a memorandum that acknowledged the Philippines could not be saved militarily, but argued they could not be abandoned either. The United States, he wrote, had to make every effort to support the defenders, even if the effort ultimately failed, because abandoning them would destroy American credibility with allies across the Pacific. He recommended building Australia as a major base for future operations. This analysis became the foundation of American strategy in the Pacific. More importantly, it showed Marshall exactly what he was looking for. Eisenhower had not asked for more information. He had not requested committees or delays. He had not softened his conclusions with qualifications. He had analyzed the situation, reached a decision, and presented a clear recommendation. Marshall's response revealed his philosophy. The War Department, he told Eisenhower, was filled with able men who analyzed problems well, but always felt compelled to bring them to him for final decisions. What he needed were assistants who would solve their own problems and report afterward. Eisenhower had passed the test. Marshall assigned Eisenhower to the War Plans Division, placing him in charge of planning for the Philippines and the Far East. Eisenhower's responsibilities expanded almost immediately. By February 1942, barely 2 months later, he had become chief of the entire War Plans Division. No officer in the Second World War rose faster. In December 1941, Eisenhower had been a lieutenant colonel. By December 1944, he would wear 5 stars as a general of the Army, promoted just 4 days after Marshall himself received his 5th star. George S. Patton presented Marshall with a very different challenge. Marshall had known Patton since the First World War and renewed the relationship at Fort Myer in late 1938 when Patton commanded the 3rd Cavalry. The two men could not have been more different. Marshall was reserved, methodical, and self-effacing. Patton was flamboyant, impulsive, and utterly convinced of his own destiny. Marshall regarded Patton as the Allies' best fighting general, but he also understood that Patton required careful management. Patton, Marshall once observed, needed an occasional break to slow him down, because he was prone to racing ahead at breakneck speed, driven by sheer enthusiasm and exuberance. Catherine Marshall, the general's wife, once confronted Patton directly. "George," she told him, "you say these outrageous things, and then look at me to see if I'm going to smile. A general cannot talk in such a wild way." Patton listened, but rarely restrained himself. At 54 years old, Patton fell squarely into the age group of officers who might have been removed under Marshall's standards. He survived scrutiny only because he demonstrated the energy, aggression, and drive of a much younger man. His performance in the Louisiana maneuvers, where his armored division ran circles around the opposition, proved that age had not dulled his abilities. Marshall promoted Patton from colonel in July 1938 to four-star general by April 1945. The path between those ranks was turbulent. Patton's mouth repeatedly endangered his career. His behavior sometimes bordered on insubordination, yet Marshall protected him because he recognized that Patton was irreplaceable. Twice during the war, Marshall intervened to save Patton. In Sicily, Patton slapped two soldiers suffering from combat fatigue, an incident that erupted into scandal once reporters learned of it. Eisenhower, commanding the Mediterranean theater, seriously considered sending Patton home in disgrace. Marshall urged restraint. Patton was too valuable to lose. Later in England, Patton again caused controversy during the Knutsford affair, when he made careless remarks implying that Britain and the United States would dominate the post-war world, with no mention of the Soviet Union. The incident nearly cost Patton his command on the eve of the Normandy invasion. Once again, Marshall intervened. Patton was sidelined, but not destroyed. Omar Bradley represented yet another path to high command. He had served as a tactics instructor at Fort Benning, where Marshall observed his teaching methods, his treatment of students, and his approach to military problems. Marshall described Bradley as quiet, unassuming, capable, and possessed of sound common sense. These were not flashy qualities, but they were precisely the traits Marshall valued most. Bradley did not seek attention. He did not promote himself. He simply did his job with steady competence. Bradley later wrote that no man had exerted a greater influence on him personally or professionally than George Marshall. Bradley rose from brigadier general in February 1941 to four-star general and commander of the 12th Army Group, the largest American field command in history. More than 1.3 million soldiers served under his leadership. After the war, Bradley became the first chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Joseph Stilwell, known as Vinegar Joe for his sharp tongue and acid personality, impressed Marshall so deeply that Marshall held open the position of chief of the tactical section at Fort Benning for an entire year until Stilwell became available. Other officers wanted the job. Marshall waited. He described Stilwell as possessing a genius for instruction and as one of the most brilliant and cultured men in the Army. Though abrasive, Stilwell spoke fluent Chinese, had studied Chinese history and literature, and understood Asia better than almost any American officer of his generation. When Marshall needed someone to take on the nearly impossible China assignment, rejected by Hugh Drum, Stilwell was his choice. The mission proved just as difficult as Drum had predicted. Stilwell clashed with Chiang Kai-shek, argued with British allies, and watched his forces suffer repeated defeats, but he never quit. He never asked to be relieved. He carried out his orders exactly as Marshall expected. The roster of commanders Marshall identified and elevated reads like a catalog of American victory in the Second World War. Mark Clark led the 5th Army in Italy. Courtney Hodges commanded the 1st Army in Europe. Jacob Devers directed the 6th Army Group during the invasion of southern France. J. Lawton Collins became one of the most aggressive corps commanders in the European theater. Lucian Truscott led divisions and corps in North Africa, Sicily, Italy, and southern France. Matthew Ridgway commanded airborne forces in Normandy and later led the 18th Airborne Corps. Walter Kruger directed the 6th Army across the Pacific. These men led American forces from the beaches of North Africa to the heart of Germany, and from the jungles of Guadalcanal to the Philippines and beyond. They defeated two of the most formidable military powers in history at the same time. Marshall's judgment was not flawless. He made mistakes and learned from them. He was especially fond of Lloyd Fredendall, once calling him one of the best officers in the Army. Fredendall commanded the largest task force during Operation Torch in North Africa. At Kasserine Pass in February 1943, Fredendall's leadership proved disastrous. His headquarters was located 70 miles behind the front. buried in an elaborate underground bunker. His orders were confusing, delivered through a personal code his subordinates could not understand. When German forces attacked, American units were poorly positioned and badly coordinated. The result was the worst American defeat of the European War. More than 6,000 American soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured. Equipment losses were severe. German commanders who had doubted whether Americans could fight believed their doubts had been confirmed. Both Marshall and Eisenhower later regretted the Fredendall selection, but the system Marshall created allowed correction. Fredendall was relieved and replaced by Patton, who rebuilt the defeated corps into an effective fighting force within weeks. Fredendall was not disgraced. He was reassigned to train new troops, where his organizational skills could still be used. During the war, 16 division commanders and at least 5 corps commanders were relieved for cause. Crucially, the system allowed second chances. Several generals removed from combat command were later given new divisions. Orlando Ward commanded the 20th Armored Division in 1945 after earlier relief. Terry Allen led the 104th Infantry Division through the end of the war after being removed from the 1st Infantry Division. This flexibility distinguished the American system from both the German and British approaches. German commanders who failed were often executed or imprisoned. British commanders who failed rarely received second opportunities. The American Army treated failure as information, not disgrace. The scale of transformation was staggering. When Marshall took office in September 1939, the Army numbered fewer than 190,000 soldiers organized into 6 divisions. By the end of 1940, it had grown to 269,000. By the end of 1941, it exceeded 1.4 million. By 1943, nearly 7 million served. At its peak in March 1945, the United States Army numbered more than 8 million soldiers, organized into 91 divisions. The army that stormed the beaches of Normandy on June 6, 1944, bore no resemblance to the force Marshall had inherited 5 years earlier. American soldiers crossed the English Channel in landing craft built in American shipyards. They were supported by aircraft produced in American factories and carried weapons forged by an industrial mobilization that transformed the American economy. But equipment alone did not win battles. The men who led those soldiers had been selected, trained, tested, and refined by the system Marshall created. They had survived the plucking board. They had proven themselves in maneuvers and in combat. They were the best officers the American Army could produce, and they led from the front. Winston Churchill called Marshall the true organizer of victory and the noblest Roman of them all. Eisenhower declared that the Army and the American people had never been so indebted to any soldier. Harry Truman said simply that millions of Americans gave outstanding service, but George C. Marshall gave them victory. Marshall later served as Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense, the only person in American history to hold both offices. In 1953, he became the first and only career soldier to receive the Nobel Peace Prize, awarded for the Marshall Plan, which rebuilt Europe after the war. The officers Marshall removed faded into obscurity. Their names appear in no histories of the war. Some accepted their fate with dignity, understanding that the mission mattered more than individual careers. Others carried resentment. For the rest of their lives, the officers Marshall promoted became legends. Eisenhower served 2 terms as President of the United States. Bradley became a 5-star general and the most respected military figure of the post-war era. Patton died in a car accident just months after Germany's surrender, but his name became synonymous with aggressive leadership. The Marshall Men shaped American military doctrine for an entire generation. Marshall himself sought no glory. When Roosevelt died in April 1945 and Harry Truman became president, many assumed Marshall would command the invasion of Japan. Instead, he remained in Washington, directing the global war from his desk. When Eisenhower was chosen to lead the Normandy invasion, a post Marshall had wanted, he accepted the decision without complaint. Truman later offered Marshall the position of military governor of Germany. Marshall declined. He wanted to return to his home in Leesburg, Virginia, tend his garden, and spend time with his wife, Catherine. But retirement did not last. Truman soon called him back to serve as a special envoy to China, then as Secretary of State, and later as Secretary of Defense during the Korean War. Marshall served until his health failed, answering every call of duty. The lesson of Marshall's officer purge extends far beyond the military. Organizations of all kinds face the same challenge: how to remove people who have done nothing wrong except grow old in their positions, how to make room for new talent when existing leaders have earned their place through years of service, how to balance loyalty to individuals against responsibility to the institution. Marshall's answer was uncompromising. The measure must be today's performance. Past achievements, friendships, and political connections could not outweigh current capability. The mission was too important. The stakes were too high. Men would die if leaders could not lead. Marshall summarized his philosophy plainly. "The truly great leader overcomes all difficulties," he said. Campaigns and battles are nothing but a long series of difficulties to be overcome. The lack of equipment, the lack of food, these are only excuses. The real leader reveals himself in triumph over adversity, however great it may be. He expressed the same idea another way. If leadership depended solely on seniority, he warned, defeat was inevitable. Give a good leader very little, and he will succeed. Give mediocrity everything, and it will still fail. That principle, demanding excellence, accepting no excuses, and measuring leaders by results, transformed an army ranked 19th in the world into the force that defeated Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. It remains George Catlett Marshall's enduring legacy. If you found this story compelling, take a moment to like this video. It helps share more forgotten stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Each one matters. Each one deserves to be remembered. And we would love to hear from you. Leave a comment telling us where you are watching from. Our community spans the globe, from veterans to history enthusiasts. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these stories alive.